Maya is the quiet center of her high school, a girl who speaks rarely but sees everything, who keeps a sketchbook of small truths and carries the weight of a secret grief. Ethan is the school's practiced bully, a boy who throws his voice around crowded hallways to hide the trembling behind his own eyes. When Ethan shoves Maya in front of lockers one misty autumn morning, the moment that follows, 10 seconds of an unexpected, incandescent consequence, becomes the hinge on which both their lives pivot. The story follows the collision, the raw, cinematic confrontation, the ripple through friends, teachers, and a fractured family, and the slow, painful choreography of confession, repair, and redemption. It is a story about the muscles of courage and the architecture of apology, about how quietness can be a shield and a catalyst, and how a single act, whether of cruelty or of compassion, can unveil buried truths and change the shape of a community. The lockers outside the art room smelled of oil and paper, the metallic tang that lives in every school where paint and adolescence have lived too long beside each other. Morning light, silver and cool, slanted through the high windows and thin bars, and fell across the hallway like secret fingers. Maya stood with her hands tucked in the pockets of her worn denim jacket, her sketchbook against her ribs, and watched the corridor as though it were a film reel. Frames of shoes, the jitter of backpacks, the halo of a phone screen. She liked to catalog things that way, small movements, the way a laugh cracked, the way someone avoided someone else's eyes. It made the day less sudden. She was quiet because it was easier than fighting for the air. Her silence housed memories she could not yet say aloud. The late night arguments that sat like wet stones against the family's small kitchen table, the hospital's antiseptic taste in her mouth when her mother's voice dropped away, the long, patient way her father had learned to be a man shaped now by absence. Quiet worked as a shield. It allowed her to be present without asking anything back. Ethan turned corners like he owned the geometry of the school. His presence bent light. He had the kind of voice that could make a joke feel fit like a verdict, and the habit of inventing reasons for his hands to be busy at someone else's expense. He wore a loose varsity jacket because it made his shoulders look broader and his scowl more legitimate. He carried a pack of resentment he emptied out into hallways. He'd been a captain of something in middle school once. A team, a group, a place where children learned that power could be measured in who you got to steer. High school, he'd steered by fear. On that morning, the high windows sent a strip of light across Maya's shoes. Her sketchbook had a new page open, a graphite study of the birch tree out on the quad, the way its branches tried to write their own map on the sky. She was in the middle of shading when the laugh started, a roll of noise a hall away, and then the proximity of it like a slow storm. Ethan and his cohort, two boys with the bored cruelty of those who had been rewarded for small humiliations, were approaching. He liked to choose his targets like a kid selecting stones to throw at a window. Their trajectory wasn't about breaking. It was about the missing sound afterward. He loved the way embarrassment rearranged someone's face into something smaller. "You're early to the art class," he said, dropping his voice like a challenge that could be thrown like a glove. Maya didn't look up. She kept the pencil moving, the tip whispering on the paper. Her silence, to him, was choice. A chance to carve a line deeper. Ethan stepped in front of her and let his backpack knock the edge of her sketchbook. Paper slid, a corner given to gravity. He could have moved on. That would have saved 1,000 small future things. Instead, he shoved. It was not a dramatic shove, more an assertion of space, a practiced movement that had been repeated on campus sidewalks, in stairwells, in places where no teacher was watching. The motion clipped Maya's shoulder, the graphite smudged under his fingers. 10 seconds. A metric Ethan never considered. is long enough to hear a door close on the wrong note and realize the song will never be the same. For Maya, the seconds multiplied, the pencil fell to the floor and struck with a tiny sound that she cataloged like life. Crumbs. The sketchbook lurched and half opened. Ethan's hand rested on her shoulder, and he looked at her the way one looks at a problem that must be solved. She could have recoiled. She could have let the hall take the shape of the moment and bent into the practiced habit of apology. That would have been the expected arc. Instead, something in the small geology of her life, years of watching, of learning the angles of people, shifted. Maya put down her hand, the way someone might set a compass on a map. She didn't push him back, didn't register the justice of him. She met his eyes fully, and in that small space there was a steadiness that was not haughtiness but attention. For a moment, the hallway reduced to just two faces in the slice of light. Ethan's expression did not change right away. He had practiced expressions like armor. Then, as if a hand that had been covering his face was suddenly removed, he saw himself reflected in her gaze. Not the caricature he expected, but something raw and unvarnished. His own eyes looked smaller there, the practiced cruelty mirrored in a face that contained no spectacle of fear, only a vertical interior of grief and accuracy. He had not expected an answer, he had expected a sound. Maya's fingers brushed the smudged graphite on the corner of the sketchbook and, with a deliberate economy, pressed the pencil into Ethan's palm. It was such a tiny action that it almost read as nothing. A kind of hush folded into the rough. Ethan's hand, large and careless, closed around the pencil as if it were a spark that might catch. The seconds hissed. A dozen students had noticed now, and the hall exhaled in 1,000 small breaths. Some laughed, an involuntary reflex to relieve tension. Some whispered as the current of gossip began to spool. A teacher's boots sounded at the far end of the corridor, a small percussion of authority. But before those boots could reach them, Ethan's fingers trembled, and then, as swiftly as a curtain falling, his face collapsed into something like the memory of a child. He let the pencil fall. His jaw worked, as though trying to chew a small animal, the self that he'd been propped into for years cracking under the pressure of the moment. A sound came from him. Not a roar, not the practiced insult, but a small, choked noise, like the last page of a book closing. He stepped back as if something had burned him. The group around him widened like water avoiding a stone. Their laughter died because a new name had entered the room: vulnerability. Later, people would say it happened in 10 seconds. They liked the number because it made the story into a parable. Ethan would remember the stretch differently. He would call it a corridor of time in which his life condensed into the weight of a graphite mark. He tasted his own unpracticed apology like iron. He wanted to be anywhere else. He wanted more than anything to erase the shiver. In that narrow hallway, under the bars of light, he felt the 8th grade boy he had been, the one whose father's hand had been an instrument of direction and a source of fear, the echoes of nights he had swallowed and which now found a voice. "What did you do that for?" He whispered, the words not aimed at Maya so much as at himself. Maya's voice was quiet, not a weapon, but a plane of calm. "Because the page was mine," she said, "and because touching someone like that tells you nothing about them." Her pragmatism was a kind of theology. The world could be catalogued, people could be seen in detail. She expected nothing of him. She offered him only a small truth. Teachers arrived, and the small ritual of an incident began, names written down, a quiet conference called, an email to parents. The hall resumed its animal rhythms, but a ripple continued to extend outward, like a pebble dropped into a cup. Ethan was shaken. At school, shaken boys become machines of improvisation, anger, defiance, the kind of garrulous insistence that masks something else. But that day something else rose instead: shame. He cut across campus with a new focus, shoulders tired as if he'd been carrying a load and now had to pay it forward. He found a bench by the old elm behind the science block and sat, his palms flat against his knees, the pencil's graphite smudge a faint memory on the skin where his fingers had been. He thought about the line of his life and how, for a long time, he had been complicit in the sort of scenes where others' dignity was a prop in his show. Word moved fast. Maya, because of the way she moved through space, quiet, careful, a person who could own her lines, was not an easy target for gossip that liked spectacle. The incident took on many shapes and corridors. Some called her brave, some said she'd been cold, a few made up softer versions that admitted fault in Ethan. But the truth, the version that mattered, was neither heroics nor humiliation. It was a small transaction, a pencil given back, an understanding opened. At home that evening, Ethan stared at the kitchen ceiling and found his father's shadow in every crack. George, his father, had been a man who defined grammar in fists. He'd raised Ethan with blunt sentences. Be tough. Don't show weakness. Do not give people the satisfaction of your soft parts. There were nights when dishes had been the only things that stopped an argument, where the kitchen light hummed and everybody held their breath until someone spoke hush into the dark. Ethan had learned to translate all uncertainty into volume. He had been repeating that translation for years at school, and now, in the small lit room, the translation collapsed. He had pressed his hand on a girl's shoulder, not to be mean for sport, but to feel like a shape in a world that had often felt like a moving target. When the shape changed, when someone simply met him without collapsing into the expected reaction, his certainty unspooled. He felt naked and stupid and small, which was a sensation he could not fit into the life he'd built. In the weeks that followed, the hallways adjusted like a chord, finding a new pitch. Maya kept her distance, but not out of fear. She carried on her cartography of the day, shading the trees on each page, noting small acts of kindness like stamps in a passport. She started a quiet club at lunch that students called the Sketch Collective. They would bring paper and charcoal and draw each other in a room where nobody had to speak the way the hall wanted them to. People came because silence can be contagious in a nourishing way. It allowed for concentrated listening. Leela, Maya's only close friend, came every day with a sandwich and a grin, and in her presence Maya's silence softened. Ethan watched around corners like someone reconstructing a life from its shadows. He avoided the front rows at assembly. He walked with a measured stride and lowered his voice when others talked loud. For someone used to commandeering noise, the transition to discretion was a constipated one. Every gesture felt like a test, and he failed in many private ways. He would find himself standing close to Maya in the corridor, not to mimic the old motion, but because he was studying a map. Their proximity felt like math, two variables arranged by proximity. Once he left her a graphite pencil on her desk with a small note, "I'm sorry." It was the kind of note that can be exploded into 1,000 interpretations. He meant it to be a beginning. She found the pencil during art class, and for a minute she looked at it like someone who had found a small proof of gravity. In the Sketch Collective later, she drew his face once. Not an accusation, but a study, and pinned it on the wall. He did not know until later that his portrait had been rendered with a tenderness he had never been taught to expect. It mirrored him in a way that made him less monstrous in his own eyes. That humility became a quiet instrument in the slow work of changing. At home, Ethan's father noticed the alterations like cracks in a facade. "You're being soppy," he said once across the dinner table, which functioned like a small war zone in their house. But his voice didn't have the finality of old. Something inside George had loosened as well. There were fewer slaps, more words that attempted to explain themselves, but failed. Ethan noticed that his father seemed tired of being an axiom. He found his father staring at his hands, and sometimes, before sleep, he would sigh and tell a story about his own father who had been cruel in other ways, who had taught him the grammar of hardness. The family had become a conversation that always stopped short of confession. After the hallway incident, the pauses lengthened into something that resembled listening. Then came the day the school announced a community art show, a fundraiser to refurbish the library, and a chance for the art students to curate something public. Maya and the sketch collective were invited to show. The plan was that each student would present work that answered the question, what does courage look like? It was an awkwardly staged question for teenagers who were still inventing courage, and of course Ethan signed up to help as a volunteer, which made people blink. No one believed in sudden gestures of goodwill without interrogating their motive. Some assumed it a ploy. Others saw it as performance. The weeks leading to the exhibit were tightropes. Maya took a series of self-portraits, not her face as mirage, but photographs of hands drawing, hands mending, hands feeding. She wanted the body of the work to be tactile, literal. Courage, she thought, is a knuckle in a machine that refuses to break. Ethan, assigned to set up lighting, hovered at the edges in the way a man who has learned to deal with objects more easily than people does. He could string bulbs and coax lamps into gentle arcs. His hands, when not threatening, were steady. He learned the electric smell of bulbs and the quiet satisfaction of a properly lit room. The night of the show, the school gymnasium was transformed into a room of small altars. String lights hallowed each piece. Folding chairs creaked. People moved like they were trying on gentle clothes. Maya's display was a row of photographs and a single, framed graphite study of a hand, giving another hand a pencil. Next to it, she had written in her tidy small script, "To make a mark is to take responsibility for it." But Ethan stood at the back, the shadows of the gym soft on his face. He had come because he wanted to witness what had happened after a scrape. He had come to learn how to be less theatrical and more exact. When people came to inspect Maya's work, he watched the way they paused. Someone leaned in and read the caption aloud, and the phrase hung in the air like a new definition. He thought about the hallway and how small the action had been, and how large its echo. At the end of the night, when the crowd had thinned and the gym smelled of perfume and sweat and polishing oil, Maya found him at the window. He had the slack look of a person who had been working hard at being different. "You did? Okay," she said. Her voice bounced off the glass. The light from the bulbs made a halo along her profile. She did not fawn or confront. She spoke the way one names an object. He laughed, an odd, incredulous sound. "I nearly broke everything," he said. "I wired the entire southern wall the wrong way." "You did not," she corrected. "You fixed the lights." He looked at her, and for the first time his apology had a shape that was less transient. "Ah, Maya," he said. The name was new on his tongue, not a weapon. "I'm sorry." For the hallway. 4. He stopped because words can be awkward tools. He had thought apologies were statements, but they weren't. They were verbs that needed the body to mean them. She watched him with a patience that had been taught by the long practice of being seen and slighted and remaining. "Apology accepted," she said simply. "Show and tell us how you're going to keep it." He considered the request and, in a way neither of them expected, chose to be literal. The next week, Ethan organized, clumsy at first, then with an emergent competence, a series of lunchtime meetings called Hands-On, where students from different grades came to help younger kids with homework, fix bicycles, and teach each other simple things: how to tie a tie, how to mix paint to get the color of the sun, how to change a punctured tire. The meetings were awkward panels of pride and humility. There were a few jeers at the beginning, but they dissipated under the steady work of those hands and the small, undeniable utility of kindness that did not announce itself. Maya came because she liked the quiet labor of mending and drawing. Ethan's change was not spectacular. He still had his scared moments, flares of old bravado, missteps. But the rhythm of his life altered. He began to speak less like a suit and more like someone carrying something pliant. He found a job fixing computers after school and learned to be patient with electrons. His father softened in ways that made them both uneasy but grateful. They sat at the kitchen table and actually tried to explain themselves sometimes. The conversations were wooden at first, and then, slowly, more honest. One crisp afternoon, as leaves skittered against the pavement, Ethan stood in the hallway, watching Maya teach a student how to shade an eye. She leaned over the paper, and the child's brow furrowed with concentration. Ethan thought about that hallway incident, the 10 seconds. He had expected either a triumph or a catastrophe. Instead, he had found both his own capacity to harm and his own capacity to be changed. He had learned that the thing he called power could be repurposed into something else, the ability to defend instead of dominate. Later, when asked how he remembered that day, Ethan would say the pencil had been a turning point because it forced him to feel the weirdness of being seen. He would say he regretted his hand on Maya's shoulder in the way someone regrets a burned bridge that you cannot rebuild in the same way. But he would also add, and mean it, that it was a useful regret because regrets, if tended, can become the soil from which apologies grow. Maya's quieter transformation was less visible and more inevitable. She stopped carrying her sketchbook like a shield and more like a tool. The sketch collective grew and began to volunteer at the local senior center, making portraits for people who had lived whole years without having someone draw them. People's faces carry stories their mouths don't tell. The students learned to look for the narratives etched into a person's hands. Maya learned to speak in ways that were not violent. She learned how to accept help without shrinking and how to ask for a seat at a table when needed. The last scene that rounded the paper of their lives into a clean fold happened in the spring under a sky the color of new notes. The school hosted a mural project on the brick wall behind the library, a communal painting meant to stitch a visible dignity into the back alley. Students were invited to contribute whatever they wanted. Maya proposed an image of a long, single hand passing a pencil to another hand, their palms meeting in the middle, the match of graphite to skin. Ethan proposed to lay down the scaffolding and help younger students paint the higher reaches, his ladder steady and competent. On the day the mural was finished, the painting shouted with color a long, steady mural of hands in different skin tones, passing tools, making marks, repairing things. In the lower right corner, barely noticeable unless you stepped close, was the small graphite streak of a pencil, a tiny echo of the hallway. Underneath, in small neat script, the caption read, "Wire what we give back." Ethan stood back and looked at the mural, and for the first time he saw himself in a community that had been changed by a small decision. He thought about the 10 seconds and how they had unfurled into months of work. Regret, he understood, was not an endpoint. It was an opening, raw and dangerous, and what you did after determined whether it turned into a wound or a lesson. Maya stood beside him, her hands still smudged with paint, a smear of blue along her wrist like a bracelet. She had drawn the hands because she believed in the literalness of work. She'd learned to let her quiet be something that could be translated into action. Ethan turned to her and offered a clumsy smile that was finally unarmored. "Thank you," he said. His voice was steady now, not because he had mastered anything, but because he had chosen to say the difficult things. Maya's reply was a small smile, a closing of a sketchbook. "Keep your hands warm," she said. It was the kind of farewell that contained ordinary prayers. They walked away from the mural together with a gravity that wasn't heavy. It was the lightness of two people who had survived an uglier chapter. The school went on, as schools do, making and unmaking habits. But in that place, the story, the one that would be told with varying degrees of accuracy in cafeteria whispers and assembly speeches, had a truth that was durable. 10 seconds can break or make you, but what follows is always the hard work of repair. Outside the school, the birch tree's branches had grown denser. Students passed beneath it like a litany, their shadows crossing and uncrossing in the afternoon sun. Maya lifted her hand and traced a line on the sky with the tip of a finger, as if mapping something that needed no explanation. Ethan fell into step beside her, and in that ordinary closeness, they found a covenant written without law that hands, once laid wrongfully, could be laid right again, not by erasing the past, but by building a future where the same hand that once hurt could also hold steady.